may proceed.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. My name is George Mdima. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at PLAAS, University of Western Cape. Today we'll be discussing a topic titled Worsening Climate Chaos and the Challenge of Climate Justice. Dr. Sadka was supposed to join us, but due to unforeseen circumstances, he cannot join us. To make an intervention today, we've got our colleague, Awande Boteles. Awande Boteles is a lead researcher and organizer at the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. He's also involved in the Food Sovereignty Campaign in South Africa and the Climate Justice Charter Movement. Boteles is going to take us through this presentation, and his intervention is on how we can get to a situation of achieving climate justice, as well as how to best understand climate change in contemporary times. So without further ado, Comrade Awante, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mudimu, and thank you for this opportunity. On behalf of my colleague, Professor Sadka, and today I will be speaking through the issue of climate change and climate justice. So I'm just going to put my presentation up. Okay. Climate change, and the Climate Justice Charter. So I'm going to begin with the background of the science, just for those who may not be familiar, and for those who are familiar, just to ground us in the familiarity or the context rather of the climate science. Then I will be going into speaking more specifically around South Africa and the African continent as a climate hotspot and what that means, a response to climate change. And then before I go into climate justice, I'll also talk about certain things on the path to responding to climate change that we must guard against, particularly the question of net zero, introducing climate justice, and then climate justice charter, and a deep just transition. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, in 2018, the United Nations International Governmental Panel on Climate released their 2018 reports on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. They've released many reports and they continue to still release reports. They've released a number as of this year and last year, more specifically. But the reason why I focus on this one is because it sets the context of what we'll be facing with regards to the next 10 years or this decade that we're currently in, up to 2030. It set the tone with regards to what is required and what is needed to limit heating to 1.5 degrees. So if you're unfamiliar with the UN IPCC reports, they are collaborative reports written by scientists from all over the world, and some of these scientists being South African scientists. And the main findings of this report was that to stop global warming at 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees, which is what was previously seen as the line at which warming should be stopped, would help limit increasing damage to ecosystems, human health, and well-being on a planetary scale. So 2 degrees, which had been seen previously as a reasonable level to which heating could be stopped at, would increase the occurrence of extreme weather patterns, rising sea levels, and decreased Arctic sea ice, coral bleaching, and further the loss of ecosystems, among other adverse effects. So the most shocking part of this report was that we had less than 10 years to limit warming at 1.5 degrees. And what this report suggested is that what needs to be done to achieve this is a rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. This is coming from the scientists. This is coming from those who work on the climate science. So I think that's a very important place for us to start with, understanding the scale and the fundamental need with regards to what needs to be changed or what our approach must entail in adequately dealing with the climate crisis. this report comes off the back of the failure of the 2016 Paris Agreement, which many at the time had seen as a landmark multilateral climate change process, because of all the nations it was able to bring to the table, and the common cause according to which they were working towards. But by 2019, and at this point, 2022, it became clear that the majority of carbon emission reductions pledges that they'd made weren't enough, particularly since the 2018 IPCC report had come out. The majority of these countries had increased their levels of ambition to reduce emissions. A level of ambitions communicated in their nationally determined commitments indicated that the changes in total emissions would be small, which would be minus 1% in 2030 compared to 2010 reduction. The IPCC indicates that the emission reductions required to meet 1.5 degrees should be around a decrease of 45% by 2030 compared to 2010. So the climate science is clear. We need a deep transformative change if we have any hope of adequately dealing with the climate crisis. And this transformation has to begin now, or yesterday rather, if we want to see the deep emission reductions required to lower heating before 2030. It is important to note also that we've already heated the world by 1 degree compared to pre-industrial levels. This image right here is just a projection of the different circumstances or scenarios that we'll be facing at different levels of heating. I just want to point your attention to the African continent. As you can see, it is a place and parts of it where there are deep red. So this will be leading into my next point about South Africa and the African continent as a climate hotspot. It is important to know that certain parts of the world will heat at a higher rate than other parts. So the African continent and South Africa, Southern Africa more specifically, heats at twice the rate of the global average. So if we're looking at 2 degrees heating across the world, you're looking at 4 degrees heating in Southern Africa and Africa more generally. So the Southern African region is vulnerable to climate change compared to other parts of the world for a number of reasons. The first part is what I've just stated with regards to the comparatively stronger climate change. And the second part is that it lacks coping capacity. So our region of the world is obviously a developing region. We're a developing country and we're surrounded by developing countries. We do not have very sophisticated disaster management systems, as you can see with the current tragedy still unfolding in the province of KZN. We do not have the adequate infrastructure required, nor money in comparison to developed countries to spend on adaptation and mitigation projects. Our economies are very sensitive to changes in the climate, particularly in the case of South Africa, the agricultural industry and the tourism industry. This is not to say that there's nothing that we can do, particularly a country like South Africa is very different to a country such as Malawi or Mozambique. But it's just to state that on a sliding scale in comparison to countries of the global north, we have a lot more to do and a lot more to deal with than they do. And finally, another reason that we are particularly vulnerable is that Southern Africa in particular is a dry and warmer region than most parts of the world, and it's only projected to become drastically drier and drastically warmer. And we know what that looks like if you look back at the previous decade from 2014 as to recently, our country was going through a drought. There's a number of parts of the country, who are still dealing with water scarcity issues, despite the heavy rains that we've been seeing. That is partly due to the climate impact and also a combination of infrastructural issues and corruption and bad governance. So we are at the crossroads of a number of factors which makes us particularly badly positioned to deal with this. And in essence, I think also when you take into consideration that the issue of climate change to many may be something that they do not consider, particularly in our parts of the world, because we feel that we are inundated with so many other problems that this is something that we cannot even afford to think about. I think that has changed drastically recently, and we have a lot of catching up to do, because obviously this is an issue that is interconnected and affects all aspects of our society and all aspects of our way of life. So just to keep in mind that at the current rate at which nations of the world are dealing with this crisis, we are on track to reach 3 degrees of heating, which will only lead to more multi-year droughts, more heat waves with greater frequency. It's also important to know that despite the fact that this part of the world is projected to become warmer and drier, we can still expect extreme rainfall events. And I think when you speak about that, or if we've spoken about this at a different time, maybe 7 years ago when Cape Town was going through a day zero scenario, and parts of the Eastern Cape and the Northern Cape were also dealing with water scarcity issues as they had been during that part of the decade, it would be hard for many to conceive how in a heating world or in a warming world, extreme rainfall events could be something which we should be scared and worried about. And I think the events of the past week and also the flooding that we've seen in 2019 has made it quite clear how vulnerable we are to those events. Not to forget also the cyclones which we've seen coming off of the coast of Mozambique, particularly cyclones such as Cyclone Idai. So we also have to contest with that at the same time. So in the response to climate change, what is the response to climate change? How do you understand responses to climate change? So responses to climate change and the response to the climate crisis can be categorized as either mitigation or adaptation strategies. There's also ways in which they can be interlinked and fall out of those two descriptive categories, but it's just an easy way to understand the ways in which we can address and look at this problem. So a mitigation is a human intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases, limiting the amount of greenhouse we put into the atmosphere, or trying to remove what is already there. Adaptation is the adjustments to process to actual or expected climate effects or impacts. So the disaster management systems, infrastructure to deal with greater rainfall or water events, dealing with droughts, dealing with other possible or particular climate impacts or natural disasters, quote unquote, that may occur due to warming or heating. So there's a number and a range of ways in which we can adjust and deal with this. There's also things which are social policies and economic policies, such as dealing with inequality. We're a country of high inequality, and thinking around those issues also falls into an adaptation strategy. So mitigation and adaptation pathways are not politically neutral. I think it's important that we understand this when speaking about climate. It's essentially first introduced or understood as a scientific issue. But the systems and processes that manage our world and that have brought us to the situation are both political and economic in character. So it stands to the fact that the response would also be political and economic in nature. And these responses have to be transformational, in the way in which they affect the personal, practical, and political spheres of our lives. It also requires a deep thinking with regards to the design practices of some of our systems, our cities, communities. And examples of some of these transformational approaches are transitioning to socially and community-owned renewables, for example, dealing with the issue of decarbonization, plus the problem of structural inequality that a country such as ours faces, enhancing access to climate jobs, and building a new food system based on food sovereignty to deal with inequality and the issue of food, just as a couple of examples. So the net zero trap, just to give a little understanding on the issue of net zero, because I think everyone has heard this term, and I think that it's not interrogated enough in terms of what does it actually mean? Is it effective, or are promises made by countries and organizations effective when coaching the language of net zero? So net zero carbon emissions means the balance between the amount of greenhouse gas produced and the amount of greenhouse gas removed from the atmosphere. We reach net zero when the amount we add is more than the amount taken away. So it's a simple calculation of give and take. Zero emissions, for example, on the other hand, rather, without the caveat of net, means emitting no greenhouse gases. So that's a very important distinction to make when understanding approaches to climate change and promises that are made by countries and companies. So net zero gives these organizations and these political structures more room to maneuver. It's like balancing a checkbook. So countries or companies cut most of its emissions through efficiency and clean energy. Then it offsets the rest by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through certain techniques, which are known as carbon sequestration, or eliminating emissions elsewhere through out their business practices of their company, or within the way in which energy is provided if you're a country. So an example of some of these carbon sequestration techniques are trees, for example, which absorb carbon dioxide from the air. So when you plant trees, or a country or a company plants trees, it's considered as negative emissions. And then there's countries like Bhutan, for example, who can claim net zero. If you want to understand what it looks like for a country to say that they've achieved or on the way to achieving net zero. So Bhutan, for example, all of its electricity comes from hydropower. Its forests sequester about 3 times more carbon than its vehicles, factories, and other human activities. Bhutan obviously is an outlier. Most countries are nowhere near to where Bhutan is. Companies, though, on the other hand, have other ways through which they claim net zero. They take advantage of carbon reductions elsewhere. So they use initiatives such as buying carbon credits. So in the United States, for example, when a company pays to protect forests in South America, they subtract the trees that they've saved in that region as negative emissions from its own emissions to say that its operations are net zero, which I think we can all see what's problematic about that. Other carbon credits that companies buy support sustainable projects in communities or places within their countries or in other parts of the world. For example, installing solar power or wind technology in developing or poorer countries. So a number of countries, including the United States, have pledged to meet the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. I think that if you've been following news on climate and responses to climate, it's something that we've all familiar with and have heard. Net zero emissions by 2050. I don't think many of us understand why or how they came to that metric, but it's something which has become quite popular. And the United Nations analysis of each of these countries' commitments made under the Paris Agreement, this analysis, which came out mid-September last year, found that they all fall short. Keep in mind the context or the situation that I'd introduced at the start with regards to the IPCC report. It's 2022. We've already lost a lot of ground in a species-defining decade where emissions have to be reduced to a 1.5 degrees heating to ensure that parts of the world, such as ours, which are more vulnerable to climate change and climate shocks, have a fighting chance. So even if these pledges which were made were met, these pledges which they are all currently falling short on, temperatures will rise to about 2.7 degrees this century. It's also important to understand that net zero, or the concept of net zero, allows companies to keep generating greenhouse gases. Some of the projects that that companies state that they have been instrumental in making happen would have happened anyway or were already planned. Emissions reductions might not be permanent or even verifiable. So you can save a couple of trees today and add more carbon into the atmosphere, or some of those trees tomorrow might be removed, but you still continue to count them. Or you are, purporting to save trees which no one can even verify have been saved. And also double counting occurs in this process. It's also important to note that certain carbon sequestration methods, such as tree planting, takes time and takes years for us to see the necessary payoff required for significant emissions reductions. Oh boy. Sorry, I was having. So the threats of climate change are direct, and the result of there being too much carbon in the atmosphere. So I think it's very clear from what the IPCC states that we need zero emissions, not net zero. We need a total reduction in emissions, not a net reduction in emissions. And it's also important to understand that a lot of these projections made on reaching net zero in the future or by mid-century are also based on the belief that certain technological solutions or innovations will occur in the coming decades, which will help us reduce emissions significantly. This belief in technological salvation also helps to diminish the sense of urgency with which we need to deal with this crisis now, which is another danger that comes with the language of net zero. It's also, I think, more broadly, easier to understand that this language and the concept of net zero basically gives a free license to burn now and pay for it later. And those who will pay for it are developing countries and the most vulnerable. So I think, just to be cautious about time, well, actually I'll just skip through this so we can get to the matter of climate justice and an effective response to the climate crisis. But just to round off this part about net zero by also bringing to focus that these carbon sequestration or carbon reduction technologies, which are being projected into the future, such as geoengineering, are not necessarily silver bullets. They do not have all the answers, and some of them are potentially dangerous and could push us into rapid and catastrophic environmental changes that we do not understand yet. They should only be used as a last resort, if ever. But to leave our hopes of reducing and dealing with this crisis, which we can do now with the time that we'll be given to these technologies, is a very, very dangerous thing. So this brings me to the concept of climate justice. So climate justice, more generally, is a disproportionate impact of the climate crisis. Communities of color, women, indigenous groups, and people of low income communities all face increased vulnerability with the climate crisis. As we can see in our own country, there's a disproportionate impact due to heat waves, air quality, and extreme weather events such as floods. There's a gendered aspect to the climate crisis. Climate change can increase gender inequality, reduce women's ability to financially be independent, and has an overall negative impact on social and political rights of women, particularly in countries in the global south, where their economies are heavily based on agricultural activity. There's socioeconomic disparities, which we see in countries like ours. Climate change has health impacts, there are economic impacts, and there are human rights impacts that need to be taken into consideration. And there's also another aspect which has to be taken into consideration with regards to indigenous peoples of the world, particularly communities on our continent, the Arctic, Asia, Australia, and the Caribbean, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific. The majority of the world's biological, ecological, and cultural diversity is located within these indigenous territories. So there's a lot of knowledge from traditional knowledge that we can take and learn to apply to our strategies to adapt to the climate crisis. Which brings me to the Climate Justice Charter. So I will run through the background quickly, just so I can focus more on what the Charter states and what a climate justice approach to dealing with the climate crisis looks like. So the Climate Justice Charter began with the fight for food sovereignty in South Africa during the drought of the past decade. In 2014, Right to Food dialogues began from a number of different groups made up of communities, small-scale farmers, and the decision to create a national campaign was launched from that. In the following year, there was an assembly to launch the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, and a hunger tribunal was hosted. In 2016, at a drought speak out and a national bread march was launched. At a drought speak out and a national bread march, the launch of the People's Food Sovereignty Act was launched. And this People's Food Sovereignty Act was then presented to national government departments. Following this, a dialogue with Parliament on drought occurred and the Climate Justice Charter process began. In 2019, the Climate Justice Charter process was launched. And these are pictures from the work of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign throughout that decade. Once this process was launched, this process included 6 roundtables throughout 2019, water-stressed community, media, labor, youth, faith-based organizations, social and environmental justice organizations were all involved in these roundtables. In 2020, a continued dialogue for input into the charter continued. Finalizing the charter occurred at an online assembly entitled Ecofeminist Speak, and then the charter was launched on Youth Day, and an official petition was also launched on the same day. Communities were mobilized, and all the various constituencies that had fed into this program were also mobilized throughout this process. And then on the National Day, a National Day of Action occurred with a parliamentary engagement on the 16th of October, where the charter and the science documents and memorandum were handed over to the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, and a debate was held with some members of Parliament with regards to their views on climate change. The Parliament of South Africa was given a year to respond and take into consideration the charter and all these documents that are handed to them, but we received no response. And last year, on October 16th, we returned to Parliament, and still yet we have not received any response. So the goals of the Charter are to advance an awareness that we thrive and coexist on one planet, to inspire a break with the thinking that it caused the crisis, to reconnect with an earth-centered conception of what it means to be human, to deepen cooperation, to overcome the crisis of corporate captured leadership, and to strengthen our democracy. The principles for a deep, just transition, which the Charter promotes, is climate justice, social justice, eco-centric living, participatory democracy, socialized ownership, international solidarity, decoloniality, and intergenerational justice. All these things feed into each other. Understanding the construction or the structure of our current societal model, and seek for ways to push forward that transformational break which the IPCC report pushed for, whilst keeping in mind the historical and societal factors that have led to the current society that we live in. The Charter then also puts forward 14 systemic alternatives for transformative change in how we both adapt and mitigate this crisis, but also dealing with the legacies of the societies that we currently deal with. The first is democratic and participatory deep, just transition plans. Second is socially owned and community-based renewable energy through a rapid phase out of fossil fuels. The third is to feed ourselves through food sovereignty. And the fourth is to democratize the water commons. The fifth is for us to enjoy life through working less. Six is to promote eco-mobility and clean energy transport systems, clean energy public transport systems. Seven is zero waste and simple living. The eighth is eco-social housing, buildings, and transition towns, which will be resilient to the coming climate crisis, but also deal with the required steps to be taken to reimagine and deal with the legacies of apartheid spatial planning. The ninth is to go beyond mainstream economics, because that was what has brought us here, and it's not what will take us out of this crisis. The 10th is that the rich must pay their ecological debts. There is both an international inequality and an internal inequality with regards to who is more responsible for the climate crisis. The 11th is that indigenous knowledge is crucial for survival and knowledge more broadly, but that we should understand, respect, and draw on indigenous knowledge, as it has a lot to teach us and a lot to guide us with regards to how we deal with this crisis. The 12th is emergency, holistic, and preventative healthcare. The climate crisis will bring about a number of health crises. And one of those projected to be is that we can face more possible pandemics. And I think that the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us what is required and what we need if we have to have a humane and effective health system that can deal with those kind of crises. 13th is to respect the rights of nature and to seek out natural climate solutions. 14th is a climate conscious media to help a citizenry be engaged and informed on these issues and how to deal with it. Finally, we have to transform the state. As I said, responding to the climate crisis is not a politically neutral endeavor. So we need a people-driven climate justice state, which enables participatory planning, which has public financing mechanisms, which introduces progressive regulations, which also decarbonizes its own practices and helps create a zero footprint, which helps redesign state structures for a warmer world, but also one which deals with the vulnerabilities that we've been given from our legacy of colonialism and apartheid. And finally, also one which prepares the country for rising sea levels. Furthermore, we must also strengthen local government, because climate impacts will be felt at the local level before they're understood at the broader national. We must develop a people-led climate disaster management system, which I think the recent floods has shown the inconsistencies and gaps and ways in which the chasm between what the state does for us and the way in which our government is there for us, how that leaves us particularly vulnerable when something which some would say is seemingly unexpected, as a disaster, as what we're going through right now in KZN, occurs. We must promote research and innovation to deal with these issues, reduce wasteful spending, ending corruption, and professionalizing the state bureaucracy is a must if we are to ever have an effective plan to address this issue and to put us on the right footing to create a society which can deal with these issues and vulnerabilities. And we must also push forward, promote, and advance a climate justice orientation in international relations, including a radical Pan-Africanism, particularly in a country such as South Africa, with its social schisms and the current sensitivities and issue we face around the problem of xenophobia. A climate justice future can only be achieved through the power of a united people. We have learned this through the struggle against colonialism and apartheid and neoliberalism. Forward to the Climate Justice Charter and a deep, just transition to sustain life. Thank you.
I want to thank you so much for this impressive intervention. We really thank you, Entry. without wasting time, I've received a number of questions, but I think I'll start with mine first. So what we do, we have 3 questions. You make an intervention, then take 3 more questions. So first, South Africa is the most sophisticated mining industrial complex, which I think is a big, hindrance to climate justice. Maybe I wish to have your reflections on that. Then the second question is that, can you share some specific data and targets which are made by the South African government with regards to the emissions reduction? Then can you briefly comment on the relationship between the climate justice and food sovereignty? Because some are saying that climate justice is a precondition for food sovereignty. So if you can intervene, then we can proceed to the other set of questions. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just noting all these questions. So I'll begin with the first question on the mining industrial complex and how it impacts us with regards to climate. I think that's a really great question. When understanding the climate crisis in the South African context specifically, we have to look at South African society. We look at South African society, how it's structured, why we are in a particularly bad position with regards to how we're dealing with the crisis, and the kind of historical legacies that have put us on this path. The mining industrial complex is, the very foundation of the colonial construction of South Africa, or South African society. The idea of South African society begins within that context. I'm currently in Johannesburg, a city which was built off or through the mines. So when the transition from apartheid to the democratic era occurs, our current government then adopts this infrastructure or this context of the mining industrial complex. What we're seeing right now with regards to how the president says that they are dealing with the climate crisis, beginning this presidential climate commission and including it in his SONA speeches, versus the actual policy that is being put forward, particularly coming from the minerals and energy departments, is completely contradictory. Where on one side you speak about dealing with this crisis in the way in which it has to. Mind you, South Africa is also a signatory to the Paris Climate Deal, and we attend and always send representatives to the COP summits. But we have a minister who is hell-bent not only on making sure that coal has a future, but also seeking out oil and gas options also. Particularly now, when we say we have a short window to deal with this. Mind you, I know a lot of people speak about South Africa as a developing country, but we are one of the top 14 or top 12 emitters in the world, and also definitely the highest emitter in the African continent. So we also have a responsibility that is different with regards to other developing countries. So that has to be taken in mind. So that's the kind of milieu or mess that we're working with regards to those inconsistencies where something rhetorically is being said by the presidents, and it's done through what's, I think would be fair to say, is political theater and organizing or setting up a commission, when an actual policy and power that is being effected by the executive through ministries and through policy is one which wants to, give fossil fuels a future. I think that, even if you consider it on the face of, oh, it's cheap or it's what we can do right now, once you put us on that path, then you're also making us path dependent, in that when the time comes to make a sharp twist away from those things, you have put South Africa on a financial and structural path, which will be so costly for us in a decade or two to turn away from, when we could set the seeds and sow the foundations of a system which we know that the world will move towards, maybe not fast enough, but will. And once international investment and international finance starts to punish and penalize countries for those investments, we will be hit very hard. With regards to climate justice and food sovereignty, well, so there are two aspects to this, so that I can give more questions also at the time, is that agricultural industry and the traditional agriculture industry is one of the top emitters or the top reasons for emissions in the world. The food sovereignty system not only tries to deal with that by moving away from monoculture and those ways in which agriculture is done, but it also seeks to challenge and address the inequality issue. Not only inequality in the socioeconomic sense, but also in the sense of access to food and the hunger crisis, which our parts of the world, particularly in other parts such as ours, are dealing with. So that's kind of the connection between climate change and food sovereignty. With regards to some of the projections, I think that there's a difficulty in understanding some of the metrics, particularly with regards to the nationally determined commitments that our country puts forward. When you look at the proposed bills and policy that our government has written with regards to the climate crisis and how we're going to deal with it, there are some, such as the climate change bill, which have a lot of redoing that needs to be done to come up to pace, not only with the current context, the current level of what the IPCC has brought to the table in terms of what we're dealing with and what needs to be done, but they're still even, not even up to scratch with meeting the context of where we were when Paris was taking place in 2015, 2016, and the 2018 IPCC report. So right now, I also want to kind of put forward, and I hope that it was kind of clear when I was speaking about the Climate Justice Charter, that the way in which we have framed the climate crisis and the way in which it's been minimized to maybe two departments, minerals and energy and environmental, is something we need to also remove ourselves from. So I'm hoping that we can expand our language, and some of my work is to help expand our language, and that when we speak about this, we have to be broader in terms of understanding what is economic policy oriented to with regards to how it deals with the climate crisis, social development, housing, water, all these departments, safety. We have to also orient and demand that we have a climate thinking across all facets of the executive and all facets of policy making in the South African government.
Thanks, Awand, for that. Then another one is just, I think you can address it later. People are requesting you to share your sources or non-neutral adaptation pathways. You can share them in the chat. Then the other one is asking, the recent floods in KZN, do you think they're a trigger, or a source of political consciousness among the leadership to address the climate crisis as an urgent issue? Then the other issue is, do you think we should separate energy transitions from, should we separate energy transitions from other extractives, including nuclear power? Then the other one is asking, do you think this is an individual Gwede problem, or it's the current, support for fossil fuels? Do you think is an individual problem? It's like the whole system. Yeah, it's the whole capitalistic system to blame for this.
Could you please repeat the second question?
Okay, so the first one is just a comment. They want you to share your sources on non-neutral adaptation. Then the second one is, can you reflect on the recent floods in KZN? Do you think they would trigger like political consciousness among the leaders? Are they a breaking point towards how the climate crisis can be dealt with among the leadership in South Africa? What are your reflections on the recent floods in South Africa vis-a-vis the climate change? Then the other issue is, do you think we should separate the energy transition from other industries, such as nuclear power and extractive industries. Then the last one is, can we really say the support for fossil fuel is Gwede Mentashe's own creation, or it's a result of a system which is supporting that?
So I'll begin with the KZN trigger political consciousness. I think it's unfortunate that we would need or possibly need such an event so close to home to perhaps, elevate and expand our understanding of this issue and how we are particularly at risk with regards to it. I do think that it'd be very difficult for something of that nature to not, take roots in people's minds when you see something so close to home. But I think that we have been seeing, obviously, as these impacts continue to be more and more frequent, kind of snowballing in that consciousness occurring. Go back to the droughts of the previous decade, the Day Zero events, and the number of water issues that communities across the country, particularly in the Limpopo and Eastern Cape, have been dealing. At that level, there has been a kind of expansion of consciousness and understanding of the different ways in which people are affected by this. And I do think that following what's happening right now in KZN and the response to this flood and the rebuild that will also have to happen in addressing the impact and the effects of that at an infrastructural and also social level in the province of KZN, that the understanding of climate crisis and our particular vulnerabilities will be something which will be more, will be more generally understood, I think, particularly not just in the KZN province, but in the South African, across South Africa more broadly. I do think that, this kind of feeds into the third question about Gwede or the ANC. Sorry, I say Gwede or the system, but I'm just going to use the ANC because the ANC is the political party in charge. So I find it difficult to separate the minister from the organization that he represents and is part of, because as I was saying in the previous round of questions, that we inherited a colonial structure in the mineral energy complex. And what this government has done is just to be the next custodians of that. There's a lot of, beyond just, the issue of the individual or the system, at the system level, the concept of the mineral energies complex and the way in which it operates has a number of issues in terms of the inequalities that are faced by mining affected communities, and also, the labor issue of, the profits that are extracted from this country and taken to capital abroad versus, the disproportionate experiences of communities in those areas and the people who work in those mines. But there's also, I would say, a more selfish reason for this fixation and this direction which this government has taken beyond just the minister. When you look at the issue of the offshore oil and gas exploration, look at the companies that were involved in those investments to Shell, such as Tebe Investments, Hoskins, and their connections to the ANC, and an ANC which we know has also been struggling with funding as of late. So these things all have like multiple dimensions according to which they occur. And this is, I think, a great example of what I was saying with regards to the non-existence of political neutrality with regards to how the climate crisis has occurred, how it's perpetuated, and how it can be dealt with. And I think that that's one of the issues that you see there. Another one that I think, which just to circle back to the second questions about separating energy transition from extractive industries, is that it's difficult to do that because when you talk about an energy transition in just the sense of decarbonization, strictly just speaking about decarbonization, it's difficult to separate it from the extractive industries because workers will also be impacted by such a transition. Hence the concept of a deep just transition, or a just transition more plainly, is that those who have done the least to contribute to the crisis must not be the ones who then pay the most for the transition away from it. So we have to protect workers. We have to protect communities that are, deeply tied to the extractive industries and have relied on the extractive industries for income. We have to reskill workers, and we have to also position these communities to also have a place in such an energy transition. So there's no real way of, you can't just separate the two. The two are quite intrinsically tied. And even going back to the issue of the minister and our leadership or our government, you look at the issue of the community of Kolobeni also and what they've been dealing with regards to trying to protect their land and their agency and how they live in their community, whilst the state has been vociferous in trying to make sure that that agency that they have over determining how their community continues to exist is handed over to a foreign multinational entity in the form of an Australian mining company. So there are a number of levels according to which these things occur. There's a number of levels according to which it's also moving forward, and how the response or lack of a response occurs. And the political aspects through which these things play out is very important to always remember and to always keep in mind as to why certain things are pushed forward and certain issues are not taken into consideration by the state. It's always more than just being down to an individual.
Thanks, Awand. And some colleagues were asking for your contacts. I have shared your profile in the chat box. Then the last question would be, like there's this, there's the climate, there's the visions in the climate justice charter. Do you think they're in line with the visions of the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy? Then the second one, do you think South Africa was really prepared to handle the KZN floods? I think you partly answered that, but people may want a political intervention from your side over the state of preparedness for climate change. Yeah, thanks.
I think that the Climate Justice Charter goes beyond the National Climate Adaptation Strategy. I think that if you go read the National Climate Adaptation Strategy as it currently stands, a lot of it is outdated within the context of what is required and what could be promised with what the science had put forward of what had to be done. And I think that it leaves out a lot with regards to the kind of totality of adaptation that is required to deal and meet with the climate crisis. I mean, I understand that a part of it also is because the way in which government works and departments specifically is that there are focus areas which you can speak to, but also you can allude to a greater kind of interdepartmental collaboration, which would have to happen in future, and then future policies and approaches to strengthening those adaptation strategies would have to be built according to. What the Charter acts as and what it acts as a foundation of and what it serves as is both as a vision statement and picture of the kind of scale and scope of what we're dealing with regards to the principles of how we should deal with the coming crisis, the society with which we would like to create, which is one which is holistic and respective of both community and individual livelihoods, but one also which does not shy away but deals fundamentally with the legacies of the apartheid system and the colonial history of our country. So it is more than just an adaptation strategy, the Charter in itself, but it's more of a societal vision statement and foundation for what a climate just society looks like and what a climate just society should be, what a climate just society should encompass. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Awand, and I wish to thank you for spending your time with us, and we look forward to more interactions in the near future. But colleagues, just before we close, we have one announcement. Next week, we are going to have another webinar on the 5th of May, I think. Same time, same place. Then we are also inviting you to a conference from the 26th to the 29th of September. It's on climate change and agrarian justice. This conference will be co-hosted by Journal of Peace and Studies, Transnational Institute TNI, CASAS and PLAAS. And please check the PLAAS website for more details. And thank you for joining us. Thank you. I want to thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's a goodbye from me and the crew behind the camera. Bye-bye. Ciao.